Army girl! What is this? A costume party? The young woman froze, her face flushing red as cruel laughter filled the cabin. A flight attendant suggested she move seats, away from the VIP section. But when the plane reached cruising altitude, a man in dress uniform stood up in the middle of the cabin. Her name is Cadet Jane Fletcher, and she earned this seat more than any of you. The laughter stopped. The cabin went silent. Everyone stared at the colonel who had just revealed himself. Who was he? And what made the entire airplane go quiet? Jane Fletcher was 19 years old, a first-year cadet at West Point Military Academy, traveling home on a commercial flight after her summer training program. She wore her dress gray uniform with quiet pride, the same uniform her father had dreamed of wearing before cancer took him when she was 12. Jane's mother worked double shifts as a waitress at a small diner just to keep food on the table. They lived in a tiny apartment above the restaurant, where the smell of bacon and coffee had become the scent of home. Jane didn't have the latest smartphone or designer clothes, but she had something more valuable: the determination to honor her father's memory through service. In her wallet, she carried a faded photograph of Staff Sergeant Michael Fletcher, a Marine medic who had saved countless lives in Afghanistan before coming home to raise his daughter with stories of honor, duty, and sacrifice. Service isn't about glory. Jane, he used to tell her while helping with homework at their kitchen table, it's about standing up when others need you, even when no one's watching. Those words had carried Jane through the brutal physical and academic challenges of West Point. While her classmates came from military families with generations of tradition, Jane was the first in her family to pursue the military path. She studied harder, trained longer, and pushed herself further than anyone else, because she knew she had to earn every opportunity. Jane had qualified for a free flight upgrade through the military discount program, a small benefit for cadets traveling to and from training. She'd never flown business class before, never experienced anything close to luxury in her life. But as she boarded the plane in her crisp uniform, she felt proud to represent something bigger than herself. The uniform meant everything to Jane. It represented her father's sacrifice, her mother's struggles, and her own commitment to serve something greater than personal comfort. Every ribbon, every button, every crease had been earned through sweat, discipline, and determination. What the other passengers didn't know was that Jane had been the top performer in her summer training class. 3 weeks earlier, she had pulled a drowning classmate from a river during a field exercise, performing CPR until medics arrived. She had saved a life while others watched in shock. But none of that mattered to the passengers who saw only a young woman from a poor background wearing what they assumed was a costume. To them, she was an outsider who didn't belong in their world of first-class comfort and privilege. Jane took her assigned seat near the front of the plane, her small carry-on bag containing everything she owned: a few changes of clothes, her textbooks, and the photo of her father. She had no idea that this flight would test everything her father had taught her about standing tall in the face of contempt. The plane was about to become a classroom in dignity and respect. As Jane settled into her seat, she noticed the looks. Passengers in expensive suits and designer dresses glanced at her uniform with barely concealed disdain. She heard whispered comments about military brats and charity cases taking up space meant for real travelers. A middle-aged woman in pearls and a Chanel jacket leaned toward her husband. "Look at that little soldier girl," she said loud enough for Jane to hear. "What is this? Bring your daughter to work day?" Her husband chuckled. "Probably flying on taxpayer money. I pay enough in taxes already without funding their little dress-up games." Jane kept her eyes forward, her hands folded in her lap, just as she'd been taught. Don't engage with civilians who don't understand. Represent your uniform with dignity. But the comments kept coming. She looks like she's 12 years old, laughed a businessman sipping champagne. Are we sure this isn't some kind of costume party? Maybe she's going to Comic-Con. A group of college-aged passengers returning from spring break joined in. Army girl! Hey, Army girl! Where's your gun? One of them called out, causing his friends to burst into laughter. Jane felt her cheeks burning. She touched the photo in her wallet, drawing strength from her father's memory. This was just another test, another challenge to overcome. That's when the flight attendant approached, a polished woman who had clearly been watching the situation unfold. Miss, she said quietly, crouching beside Jane's seat. I'm sorry, but we've had some complaints. Some passengers feel uncomfortable with the military presence in the premium cabin. Would you mind moving to a seat in the back, just to keep the atmosphere pleasant for everyone? Jane looked up at the flight attendant, her eyes wide with disbelief. I have a valid ticket for this seat. I qualified for the military upgrade program. I understand, the flight attendant said with fake sympathy. But we need to consider all of our passengers' comfort. The back section is very nice, too. The businessman who had been drinking champagne leaned over. Look, sweetheart, this isn't the military cafeteria. Some of us paid real money to sit up here. Jane felt tears threatening to spill, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these people. She gathered her small bag and stood up with as much dignity as she could manage. Of course, she said quietly. I wouldn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. As she walked toward the back of the plane, she heard the comments following her. Thank God. Now we can relax. Probably got that uniform at a thrift store anyway. These military kids think they're entitled to everything. Jane found a seat in the very last row, next to the bathroom. The smell of disinfectant mixed with her shame as she buckled her seatbelt. She stared out the small window at the clouds below, trying to remember her father's words about service and sacrifice. For the next hour, she sat in silence. She didn't order anything to drink, didn't ask for snacks, didn't move from her cramped corner. She just endured, the way her father had taught her to endure hardship. What none of the passengers knew was that 3 weeks earlier, Jane had risked her own life to save a drowning classmate during a training exercise. While others stood frozen on the riverbank, Jane had dove into the rushing water and pulled her unconscious teammate to safety. She had performed CPR until medics arrived, bringing her classmate back to life. She was a hero. But to the people on this plane, she was just a poor girl playing dress-up in a uniform she didn't deserve to wear. Jane closed her eyes and waited for the flight to end, unaware that someone had been watching everything and was about to change her life forever. Comment the name of someone in your family who served and still deserves respect. At 35,000 feet, as the cabin service was winding down, a man in the front row stood up. He had been silent throughout the flight, reading military reports and occasionally glancing toward the back of the plane where Jane sat alone. Colonel James Morrison was 62 years old, a decorated officer with 38 years of service. His dress blue uniform bore the ribbons of someone who had seen combat in 3 different conflicts. But today, he wasn't traveling as a military official. He was flying home from the most important visit of his life. He had just spent a week at Walter Reed Medical Center, where his daughter Emma was recovering from injuries sustained during a training accident at West Point. Emma had been pulled from a river by a fellow cadet after nearly drowning during a field exercise. The doctors said she would have died if not for the quick thinking and courage of her rescuer. The cadet who saved his daughter's life was named Jane Fletcher. Colonel Morrison had watched the entire shameful display of discrimination with growing anger. He had listened to passengers mock the young woman who had given his daughter a second chance at life. He had seen her dignity as she was forced to move to the back of the plane, and he had reached his breaking point. Standing in the aisle, Colonel Morrison's voice carried the authority of nearly 4 decades of military leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention." The cabin fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the flight attendants paused their service to listen. "My name is Colonel James Morrison, United States Army, and I have something to say about the young woman you've been treating like garbage for the past hour." He gestured toward Jane, who looked up from her seat in the back, her eyes wide with surprise. "That cadet's name is Jane Fletcher. 3 weeks ago, she saved my daughter's life." A collective gasp went through the cabin. The passengers who had been laughing suddenly looked uncomfortable. Colonel Morrison's voice grew stronger, more commanding. "During a training exercise at West Point, my daughter Emma fell into a fast-moving river and was pulled underwater. While other cadets stood on the bank in shock, Cadet Fletcher dove into that river without hesitation." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "She swam through dangerous currents, pulled my unconscious daughter to shore, and performed CPR until medics arrived. The doctors told me Emma would have died if not for Jane's courage and quick action." The businessman who had been drinking champagne suddenly found his glass very interesting. The woman in pearls studied her manicured nails. Colonel Morrison continued, "This young woman is the top-ranked cadet in her class. She maintains a 4.0 GPA while training to become an officer in the United States Army. She comes from a family where her father died serving this country, and her mother works 2 jobs to support her daughter's dream of military service." Jane sat frozen in her seat, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. She had never imagined that her actions that day had saved the daughter of a colonel, or that anyone would ever stand up for her like this. "And you—" Colonel Morrison's gaze swept across the first-class cabin, taking in every passenger who had participated in the mockery. "You treated her like she was trash. You laughed at her uniform. You forced her to move to the back of the plane because her presence made you uncomfortable." His voice grew cold with controlled anger. "That uniform represents sacrifice you can't comprehend. That young woman has already served this country with more honor than most people show in a lifetime." Colonel Morrison walked to the back of the plane, every passenger watching in stunned silence. He stopped beside Jane's seat and came to attention. "Cadet Fletcher," he said formally, "on behalf of my family and my daughter Emma, thank you for your service and your courage." He rendered a perfect military salute, holding it for a full 5 seconds while the entire plane watched. Jane struggled to stand in the cramped space, returning the salute with trembling hands. "Sir, I was just doing what anyone would do." "No," Colonel Morrison said firmly. "You did what a soldier does, what a hero does." He turned back to address the cabin. "This young woman belongs in the front of this plane more than anyone else here. She's earned that right through service, sacrifice, and courage." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in the flight, no one had anything cruel to say. What happened next surprised everyone, including Jane. An elderly man 3 rows ahead stood up and began to clap. Slowly at first, then with conviction. He was a Vietnam veteran, and he recognized the look of someone who had served with honor. Then another passenger joined in. Then another. Within moments, the entire plane was applauding. Not out of guilt or obligation, but out of genuine respect for a young woman they had completely misjudged. The flight attendant who had forced Jane to move approached with tears in her eyes. "Cadet Fletcher, I owe you an apology. Would you please allow me to move you to first class? It's where you should have been all along." But before Jane could respond, the businessman who had been drinking champagne stood up. "She can have my seat," he said quietly. I'm sorry for what I said earlier." The woman in pearls removed her expensive scarf and approached Jane. "My son is in the Navy," she whispered. "I should have known better. I should have shown respect." One by one, passengers who had participated in the mockery approached Jane to apologize. The college students who had called her Army Girl looked ashamed as they shook her hand and thanked her for her service. A 13-year-old girl who had been traveling with her parents pulled out her phone and asked, "Can I take a picture with you? I want to be like you when I grow up." The photo of Jane in her uniform, standing beside Colonel Morrison while passengers applauded, would later go viral on social media with the hashtag #DonSaluteCadetJane. When the plane landed, Jane was the first to be invited to disembark. As she walked through the airport terminal, still in her uniform, people stopped and stared. But this time with respect, not mockery. A little boy tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mommy, is she a real soldier?" "Yes, sweetheart," his mother replied. "She's a real hero." Jane called her mother from the airport, her voice still shaky with emotion. "Mom, something incredible happened on the plane today." Her mother listened to the story, tears streaming down her face. "Your father would be so proud, Jane. He always said that sometimes you have to go through the darkness to reach the light." 2 weeks later, Jane received a letter from West Point. She had been selected for a special commendation for her actions during the river rescue. But more importantly, she had learned something about courage that no textbook could teach. Sometimes standing up for what's right means standing alone. But sometimes, if you stand long enough with dignity and grace, others will find the courage to stand with you. The young woman who had been forced to sit in the back of the plane had shown everyone what true first-class character looked like. Sometimes honor doesn't come from rank or status. It comes from standing tall when others try to make you feel small. Jane didn't need applause or recognition. She just needed to be seen with the respect her father had fought to protect. The respect her uniform represented. We don't choose where we're born or how much money our families have, but we can choose to live worthy of the values we wear on our sleeves. That day, a plane full of strangers learned that true first class isn't about the seat you buy. It's about the character you carry. Some uniforms are earned with quiet courage. What's one phrase your grandfather said that still lives in your heart? Subscribe to HC Stories if you believe some uniforms are earned with quiet courage, and that even the smallest salute can restore dignity.